The 1950s and 60s are often regarded as the golden age of airlines, offering luxurious seating, fancy meals, and beaming flight attendants. But while it was certainly roomier than today's modern sardine can technique of travel, there was also a fair share of less desirable details unseen in the black and white evidence left behind. So what was it really like to fly during the Elvis era? Let's take a trip through the many ups and downs of getting around in the olden days. Hope you like cigarettes? Lots and lots of cigarettes. It's about to get Mad Men cloudy up in these skies. Before we depart, please make sure you fasten your seatbelts and subscribe to the Weird History channel. For all the complaints of modern air travel, there's no denying that it's significantly more affordable than it has ever been to fly. This is mostly thanks to a push for deregulation starting in the 1970s, a decision that led to competing prices and the number of air passengers to subsequently triple in the 40 years to follow. Flashback to the golden age, and it wasn't uncommon to pay 5 times as much as you would today, creating a business solely accommodating the wealthy. According to one TWA brochure from 1955, a round-trip ticket from Chicago to Phoenix went for a deceptive total of $138. When accounted for inflation, that amount translates to roughly $1,200 in modern dough, and that's not even a cross-country trip. It's hard to imagine wearing your tight-fitting Sunday's finest to spend hours sitting elbow to elbow with a congested stranger, but this was exactly the case back in the days of Don Draper. Due to the high cost of travel, many people would save up in order to fly, making the ordeal way more of an anticipated event than a vacation hindrance. Acceptable attire was more commonly 3-piece suits for men and dresses and jewelry for women. As flights became more common and prices went down, the formality slowly waned until the 1980s, when travelers began dressing for comfort rather than appearance. Nice sweatpants, Chachi. Despite the deregulation of airlines in the 1970s, one area the government got more involved in was airport security. Of course, anyone who has recently taken the shoeless walk through the TSA is more than aware of that. Before the days of metal detectors and body scans and pat-downs, airports were more like bus stations than the checkpoint-laden terminals of today. Not only could passengers arrive as late as 20 minutes before their flight, but be joined by friends and family all the way to the gate. No ID, no problem. Truly was the 1960s a golden age for convenience, just as long as you don't mind getting your airplane hijacked every now and then. And when we say now and then, we literally mean dozens of times a year. In fact, thanks to the lack of security, between the years 1968 and 1972, there were 130 American airplane hijackings. Sometimes more than one on the same day. Now that I think about it, maybe having to throw away your mouthwash isn't such a bad thing after all. Forget those extra legroom fees. Airlines in the 1950s actually went the extra mile to ensure your stems were given the 5-star treatment. What would be considered first-class legroom today was commonplace for the average traveler of yesterday. Early flights had no distinction between business or economy class seating, and when they did finally add a first class, coach-going passengers were still given ample room to wiggle their toes. So if the so-called cheap seats had plenty of space, what did the first-class passengers get? A hotel room with wings? Depending on the airline, the better-paying accommodations had everything from dining tables to bunk beds to full lounges. Dangerous? Probably. Comfortable? Definitely. Believe it or not, in-flight smoking only became banned in the U.S. as late as the 2000s. Before then, passengers were allowed to light up on certain flights longer than a few hours. In the 50s and 60s, however, smoking was nonstop and downright common. In fact, the only place you couldn't smoke was in the airport terminal, as companies feared that a flame might ignite nearby fumes. Along with allowing cigarettes, airlines often provided free alcohol to help passengers pass the time. After all, these were the days before smartphones and Wi-Fi. Besides getting hammered, airlines would entertain passengers with postcards they were encouraged to fill out for loved ones. Because there's no better time to write home than when you're drunk in a turbulent tin can. Unless you're willing to pay extra, most modern air travelers can hope for a few bags of chips and a plastic cup of Coke. Back in the golden age, economy passengers were fed fare comparable to an upscale restaurant. The menu often included lobster, roast beef, or prime rib served with champagne or brandy. Meals were served over multiple courses on real china and glassware. While this sounds like an endless luxury that trumps even the nicest first-class seats, the entire ordeal was primarily used to distract passengers from the less modern fallbacks of 50s flying. Because with all these bells and whistles, the golden age of getting around was downright torturous. We've talked a lot about the many extinct comforts of 50s air travel, but have you wondered why the airlines felt such a need for luxury in the first place? It wasn't just the high prices that drove this golden age of comfort, but rather the need to compensate for the subpar technology of the times. For starters, until the 60s, passenger planes were propeller models like the Lockheed Constellation and Douglas DC-7. Along with being unpressurized, low-flying, and bumpy, these type of planes were extremely loud. We don't see air sickness as much nowadays, but back when planes couldn't navigate over or around bad weather, vomit bags were a regular necessity. Not to mention that these smaller planes often required passengers to take 4 or 5 separate flights to travel longer distances. With such small planes and clunkier engines, walking the aisles was like a deadly game of American Ninja Warrior. The combination of turbulence and relaxed safety meant that the many comforting decorations, real cutlery, and lounge seating became a very uncomfortable obstacle course. This only got worse with the introduction of first class, as the partitions used to section off the plane were often made from extremely shatterable glass. One surprise bump, and a trip to the bathroom became an impromptu stunt spectacular. Combine all this with the fact that you were over 4 times more likely to die on a flight in 1952 than today, and it's no wonder that airlines were so dedicated to making their customers happy, or should we say, less miserable. It's no secret that the job of air hostesses was exclusive to women well into the modern times, and it takes little imagination to picture the stress level of a job requiring you to serve drunk, stressed-out travelers while donning miniskirts and pillbox hats. But there's even more to this occupational nightmare than what you think. Along with the desired uniforms, often involving skirts that increasingly grew shorter as the 60s progressed, the job of a flight attendant was heavily dictated by the rules of the airlines. Along with dress codes, stewardesses were often given a limit on how much they could weigh and how they were to behave. They were required to be single and outgoing while also maintaining a personal moral standard decided by each airline. It wasn't abnormal for a flight attendant's job interview to even require that she hike up her skirt in order to prove her legs were nice enough for the uniform. Airports didn't always have the complicated baggage handling system we take for granted today, and so back before the invention of the carousel, all luggage traveled to and from the plane by hand. That meant each passenger would need to visit a specific counter after their flight, present a porter with a ticket, and then sit and wait for each of their bags to be retrieved. The only silver lining? There were no limits on how many bags you could bring, as luggage fees wouldn't be invented until the 1990s.